Hey, it's Rick Probst.
And Dan Ratcliffe.
And Morgan.
You're listening to Faith Talk Live and watching us on Zoom, and what a pleasure to talk again. This time we can see him, guys. It's Steve Gregg, and he's the host of The Narrow Path. Steve, how are you?
Well, I'm doing okay so far.
So far.
Well, we never know.
Now, we mentioned before we went on Zoom and started recording the show that you've been in lockdown, but you're pretty used to sticking around the house there. You do your show and you do everything. So what do you do to get out when you go out?
Well, I don't go out much except to shop or to pick up the mail. I really don't have a lot of reasons to go out at this time. I used to travel a lot until this virus became an issue. And I would hold a lot of local meetings. We've had to cancel most of those. So there's not much that I go out for except to pick up the mail and when I need to pick up groceries.
Your show is on 5 p.m. on 590 WDWD, and it's a biblical answer show. People ask you those questions. Okay, so what are they asking now? What's the topping? Obviously, it's the pandemic. But what are they talking about? Why do we have it? Is it God? Where do we go? What are they saying?
Well, people are asking if this is, God, or if this is eschatological. I can't really say that most of my callers are asking about the subject, though it seems like nowadays, every day, at least one is. We probably have between 6 and 12 calls a day on different subjects. So, it's pretty common nowadays for someone to call and ask, do I think this pandemic is a sign of the times? That's pretty much the question I get on that subject. But really, the program goes all over the field on just about anything people are curious about in the Bible or about Christian life or theology or whatever.
We're talking with Steve Gregg. He is the host of The Narrow Path. You can hear it on Faith Talk Atlanta. It's WDWD at 5 p.m. So what do you tell them, the ones specifically for the pandemic? Are you one that said this is it, or this is as Jesus talked about, the birth pangs before the big end? Where are we in the whole scheme of things?
Well, I don't feel like I have the competence to say how near the end we are.
Mm-hmm.
I happen to be too old to make many predictions about that. I was in the Jesus movement 50 years ago, and we were told that Jesus was coming back any moment then. And since then, I've had grandchildren. So I guess if you live long enough, you learn that every time somebody cries wolf, that doesn't mean you should believe there's a wolf. And seems like anytime something really negative happens to us in America, suddenly we think the sky is falling.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, this is larger than America. This is global. But the truth is that there's been global, or at least continental issues in the third world steadily for 2,000 years, and in the first world too often. So, I mean, this is a big thing. But I don't think it's bigger yet than the bubonic plague was 500 years ago. I mean, there's just because it's the worst thing or the most disruptive thing that we've had in this part of the world, does not, to my mind, speak of a guarantee that this is a sign of the times. There could be worse things off, and they could be another generation into our future.
We're talking with Steve Gregg. Now, Steve, there's a lot of folks out there who are very fearful and very anxious. What, as someone who is well-versed in the Bible, what would you tell them? Obviously, there's a lot of verses in the Bible that speak about not fearing and not being anxious. But how do you work in this? Because there is a lot of fear out there.
Well, I think there is a problem that Christians, when things are going well, forget how to trust God. You don't have to trust God if you're healthy and if you're prospering and if everyone around you is doing well and your family's happy. But really, we're supposed to be trusting God all the time. And trusting God, to my mind, means you just go about the business of fulfilling His will in your life and let Him worry about the consequences. Now, those consequences could be that you get sick or even that you die. Well, there's nothing novel about dying. Everybody dies.
Right.
If you die of a pandemic or if you die in an automobile accident, I don't suppose it makes much difference in eternity. And of course, nobody wants to die and leave their children unraised or anything like that. I do remember when my children were still at home, that I was not eager to die and leave them unfinished being raised. But I don't know. Ever since I've been following the Lord, I've just thought, well, whenever God wants me to go, He's wiser than I am.
Hmm.
He knows the best thing. He won't let me die. He won't let anything happen to me unless it's something that He thinks is the best thing for His purposes, and no doubt for my own. So I think childlike trust in God is what Christians often lack.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure why, because that's what being a Christian really is defined by.
Right.
So a fear of death. I remember when I was 10 years old, I went to a Billy Graham crusade in Los Angeles. I was raised in a Christian home, and I already had made some decision for Christ or another, but I was pretty young. But I remember I went forward again at a Billy Graham crusade in LA, and I remember specifically because I heard him in his sermon there. He said, because I'm a Christian, I don't have to be afraid to die.
Hmm.
Now, at age 10, I had never thought very much about death,
Mm-hmm.
of course, but I remember thinking, that just struck me that, well, that's true, isn't it? You know, if you're saved, you don't have to be afraid to die. And so, I mean, ever since then, I've just realized that not being afraid to die is almost part of the definition
Hmm.
of being a Christian. They love not their lives unto the death, it says in Revelation 12:11. And so, if we do love our lives, we're missing, in a sense, one of the basic things that Jesus said. If anyone come after me, let him deny himself. Or
Mm-hmm.
the way he said it in Matthew 16 was, whoever seeks to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. Now, of course, if you die of a disease, you don't feel like you lost it for Jesus' sake. But if your life is lived in trust of God, then all your circumstances are counted to be, whatever He brings, because He can protect. I don't believe that God brings disasters necessarily. It's not necessary to look at it that way. Job, we can see the disasters that came upon Job, disease, poverty, loss of family members. Those were brought by the devil, but they were not brought by the devil without God's permission.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And if God did not think that that was a good thing in the long run to happen to Job, God wouldn't have given that permission. He had a hedge
Right.
around Job. The devil couldn't touch him. And
Right.
so I have to look at God's sovereignty in my life, and I would suggest every Christian do so, and say, hey, my life is in God's hands, and I'm going to trust Him. But I think, again, when things are not going badly, and in America they very seldom go as badly as they are all the time in most of the world,
Right.
I think we forget that we're supposed to be trusting God. I mean, we say we are, but what is there to trust Him for? Everything's going cool. It's all good.
Good word.
Steve Gregg, the Narrow Path in Faith Talk Atlanta, 590 WDWD.
Go ahead, Morgan.
Yeah. So, Steve, I've read your testimony on your website, The Narrow Path, and it is an incredible testimony. And I just wanted to ask, how do you feel like your journey, your faith journey, has prepared you for a time such as this to encourage your listeners and encourage you? You have a community well invested in you and your show and your ministry. How do you feel like your walk throughout the years has prepared you to encourage them in this time?
Well, I'm a little unusual in the way that I have walked the last 50 years of my ministry. And I don't say everyone has to do it, but I'm glad I did. And that was when I left home and went into the ministry in 1970, just 50 years ago now. I was influenced by George Mueller. I felt like, here's the thing. I knew that there were people out there who had miracles in their ministries, and I was not
Right.
going to be necessarily one of them. I don't have a healing ministry or miracles ministry, but I just thought, if you see God miraculously working in your life on a regular basis, that must keep your life with God very vital, I would think, and keep God very real to you, not just something you say you believe, but something you see and know. And yet I knew I didn't have that kind of miraculous ministry, but I thought, George Mueller saw miracles all the time. He didn't work healings and things like that either, though he's a man of great faith. And he, as most people probably know, he ran orphanages in the 1800s in England, and he was a man who took care of 10,000 orphans and gave away tens of thousands of Bibles and so forth. And he never had a salary. He never told anyone his needs. His choice to do it that way, he said, was because he found so many Christians who were worried. And he said
Right.
he thought it was a reproach to their God that they were worried when they have so many promises from God to take care of them. And so he said, he wanted to live his life that way, and he did for 70 years or 73 years. He lived his life totally by faith as a demonstration that God is faithful so that Christians could be encouraged. I remember reading that when I was a teenager and thinking, yeah, that's what I want to do. So when I left home in 1970, I made a determination I'll never receive a salary, except unless I do menial, regular work. I mean, if I work at a secular job, and I have done that sometimes, but in the ministry, I'll never take a salary, and I'll never let anyone know my needs. Again, I don't believe anyone else has to do that, but I'm glad I did, because throughout my whole life, I've seen God provide timely, amazing, unpredictable ways. I mean, frankly, virtually all of my income is unpredictable, although now I get Social Security pretty predictably, but because I'm old. But when I was young, all my income was unpredictable. And except sometimes I would get jobs. I don't want to make it sound like, you shouldn't work at a job if you're in the ministry. I was not in full-time ministry immediately. And I believe that you shouldn't expect God to provide full-time provision if you're not working for him full-time. So I would work part-time or full-time as ministry demands allowed. But as the ministry took up more of my time, and by 1983, and since then I've just been in full-time ministry, there's no opportunity to hold any other kind of job. I've just not really had predictable income at all. And yet I've seen just wonderful provision. I've also been in pretty good health. Right now I've got sort of something in my throat, but I'm not sick. I've had a pretty good health. I'm not a health and wealth believer. I believe that we can get sick. I believe that we can be poor. In fact, frankly, I was poor for a lot of that time. But what really made it worthwhile is that God did remain very real to me. My whole life had to, because every month I had to pay bills, and I had no way of, paying them unless God provided, and he did, always, timely, in amazing ways. So you asked how my life might have prepared me for, say, a crisis such as this. To me, trusting God is just what you do. It's just, it's what children do when they have a father. I remember once I was worried about a bill that was coming up, and I was kind of fretting about it. And I just felt like the Lord spoke to my heart from the scripture. He said, your father knows that you have need of these things. That's all I need to know. As long as God knows what I have need of, what is there to worry about?
Right.
Steve Gregg, The Narrow Path on 590 WDWD, 5 p.m. Check it out. Steve, we appreciate you. We got to go to a break. God's blessings to you. We'd love to talk to you and see you again here pretty soon.
Well, that'd be great. God bless you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Hey, we'll be back. I'm Rick Probst.
I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
And I'm Morgan.
This is Faith Talk Live. Stay there.